So again, just thank you for joining us. And I'm Adam Watson with the Washington County Extension Office. And this evening, we're going to be talking about growing your own vegetable transplants. And I'll just mention as we go through this evening, it is possible that you may hear me reference a brand name or a trade name. Just understand that's not any sort of endorsement. That's just a point of reference to help for clarity. And certainly similar type products would be just as suitable. And so we do not endorse products in these presentations. So I thought we'd just talk a few minutes of why we use transplants in our vegetable gardens. Because certainly, let's say up front, you don't have to do it. Almost any plant that we grow as transplants and then place into our vegetable gardens could be direct seeded. But there's some very particular reasons why we like to do transplants. One of those is when we're talking about our warm season crops. So those things that are frost sensitive that in our area of Northeast Tennessee, we're probably going to wait, if we're conservative at least, until the first week, maybe 2 weeks of May before we set those out. So this would be things like tomatoes and peppers, squash, and a number of other different crops. When we are able to use transplants with these warm season crops, we can actually basically get earlier production in the season, because quite literally we're starting those plants earlier than if we were planting seeds in the garden. And so that allows us to have a longer harvest season. For cool season crops, there's a couple of different things. So let's talk about our spring cool season crops. So like broccoli and cabbage, whenever we actually do these as transplants, it allows us again to be planting out sooner, not so much to lengthen the harvest season, but to make sure that that harvest occurs before we start getting the warm seasonal weather of the summer season. I've actually had the experience before with a broccoli trial crop where we put it out. It was looking beautiful. It was doing great. Everything going according to plan. And quite literally, basically the week before we would have started harvesting, we had a week of 90-degree weather in May. And it just absolutely destroyed it. It turned a beautiful crop into basically a lost crop, because that hot weather pushed the broccoli to quickly flower or bolt, and so it was lost. And so, if we'd gone into that planting 2 weeks earlier, we probably would have gotten most of that harvest out before that happened. And so, it's those scenarios while we look at our cool season spring crops, we like transplants because it lets us not have that heartache most of the time. Fall gardens, certainly, it allows us to plant crops. And again, because we're getting a jump on the planting of those in the garden, we make sure we have maturity of those crops before the cold weather and frost arrive. So we use transplants depending on which crops we're talking about, and maybe slightly different reasons, but the biggest reason it allows us to have a better harvest or an earlier harvest compared to with direct seeding in our gardens. So another factor that comes into play with this is we're able to have plants that are physically larger and stronger going into the garden. This is important because when we have strong, healthy plants, they are better able to resist pests. So I'm familiar with one farm in another state, so it's not denigrating any local producers, that they basically are growing summer squash because of kind of a niche market they have, and they're also organic, and they've been doing summer squash, both zucchini and yellow, for years. And because of that, while they rotate around on the farm as best they can, they have a pretty significant pest population there. And so they have found that when they try to direct seed, those young plants just absolutely get hammered, especially by some insect pests. So having that stronger plant being transplanted actually can help a plant get off to a much better start. And that may be a little bit of an extreme example, but certainly stronger plants do resist pests better. The other thing that we can do with transplants is basically once we put them in the ground, that's it. Whenever we're direct sowing, sometimes we have to come back. We have to thin out plants because we actually may sow thicker than what we want those final plants to be spaced in our garden. Sometimes that's a good thing. We can think of like with leafy greens or something like that. When we thin those out, we can eat them. Other time, it's just labor that we have to undertake. And certainly sometimes too, we have to replant in the garden when we're direct sowing. And certainly it can happen with transplants too. Not that a transplant couldn't fail to thrive or survive, but certainly whenever we're selecting seedlings to go into the garden, we can choose those that are most likely to survive and maybe save some effort with replanting. And another consideration is if you work with gardeners that may have some sort of physical limitations or mobility limitations, sometimes working with transplants rather than small seeds can actually be something that's easier for them to have success with. So there is that factor as well that may come into play for some of your reasons to use transplants. For me, I think one of the best reasons to look at growing your own transplants is the variety that's available to you. So I borrowed some pictures from rareseeds.com. That's Baker Creek heirlooms, if you're familiar with those. They're one of a number of different companies that have some very sometimes unusual or at least out of the ordinary vegetable varieties available to us. You can see there their listing of tomato categories. If you're unfamiliar with blue tomatoes, they're probably not quite blue. It's probably more of a purple, but they certainly are very unique in color. And it's due to high anthocyanin content. Anthocyanin is a pigment that gives us our purples and our reds colors. Very interesting. But the actual tomato you see there is a great white tomato, a large beefsteak tomato that is a very soft yellow at maturity, is actually referred to as a white tomato. Very interesting. I've grown those. I've known commercial growers that have grown those successfully. But those are the sort of things that if you're just going to big box stores or even farm stores, you're not going to always find those unusual and different sorts of varieties out there to try. And so when you grow your own, the sky's the limit. And certainly there's a host of great seed companies out there that you can source some very different types of vegetables from. Another thing to take into consideration is the timing of when your transplants are ready to go into the garden. So you'll hear me talk about this quite a few times, and you've probably already heard it if you've been in one of my classes before. A lot of people start planting things too early in the garden in our area. If you want to be a little bit, bold and start planting some tomatoes or peppers in late April, it's a little bit of a risk. But certainly, there are times when I've been in retail establishments in our area, it will be early April, and they'll have tomatoes and peppers and things like that that are ready to go in the ground. They don't need to wait, 3 weeks, which is what would be probably ideal. And so, when you do wait to that first or second week of May, sometimes the selection's really picked over. And it's because people see them, they want to go ahead and get started. And some years you're okay planting early. There are years when frost or cool weather is not an issue, but then there's a lot of years where that just leads to heartache. So one thing about that transplant production is when you're in control of it, you can time it for when you choose to go into your garden, and you don't have to get what's left over because people that wanted to go in early got all the good stuff. And certainly I still think, to me, as much as I know about plants and I work with them professionally, I still think it's just plain fun to grow things from seed. And so, anytime that you can grow plants, I'm always in favor of it. So I do think there's those intangible benefits to growing transplants where you're starting from seed, ending up with a plant that ultimately turns into your harvest. So to me, I think every individual might bring something different, but I think there's a lot of good reasons to use transplants. But I think we also have to be honest and talk about maybe reasons why we wouldn't use self-grown transplants. First off, it takes some effort. It's going to take time. It will cost some money. And certainly it takes having a space to do it. So there are limitations that may be different for everyone's situation. And because of that, not everybody's going to be in a great setup to do it. So certainly there's nothing wrong with purchasing transplants. We don't want to give that ideal to anyone, but there is, the reality of your situation. The other thing is a lot of our vegetable varieties simply do not require that a transplant be used. Even something like tomatoes, we can direct sow those. In fact, when you look at commercial tomato production, those that are going into processing. So for all our cans, tomatoes and juices and sauces and things like that, those actually aren't transplanted. Those are typically direct seeded into the production fields. Has to do with the value of that harvest. And so it doesn't support the additional cost of growing transplants. So certainly even things we may think of tried and true as being transplant only, we certainly can grow from seed. And another thing is, not every transplant is going to survive and thrive and do well. There are some vegetables, and I think particularly with the cucurbit family. And so those are the cucumbers, the cantaloupe, squashes. Those are not the best or easily or most easily transplanted. There's a couple recommendations associated with those, and one of those is making sure you disturb the roots as little as possible if you do choose to transplant those. And one of the ways you can do that is by using the extruded peat pots. And what's good about those is those can be planted into the ground because they do break down. And then that way you're not tearing those pots open and damaging any roots. But I will caution you that peat pots, as well as other biodegradable pots, when you plant them, they shouldn't stick up out of the ground. Because when they do, because those materials are permeable to water, it can actually act like a wick, and you can lose much more water to evaporation that way out of your soil. So you can dry out that little immediate area around the plant more quickly. So just be aware, if you are going to plant a biodegradable pot like that in the ground, don't let it extend above the surface of the ground. Make sure it's covered by the soil so it doesn't wick that moisture out of that area. So some of the questions you may have are, well, what crops would I consider growing transplants for? And you can see here, this is from one of the resources that I'll give you the link to, the Garden Planning Plant Preparation and Planting publication from University of Tennessee. And you can see there a list. You'll see some that are typically done only as transplants, some that are done only as seeds, and then some that are commonly done both. So certainly you've got options depending on what you grow in your garden. Now, I will say that, although not commonly done, there are things like sweet corn that in special circumstances gets transplanted. So I've heard of some market gardeners, some small farmers who are trying to capture the earliest possible sales at a farmer's market for like sweet corn, for instance. They'll actually grow sweet corn transplants. And certainly home gardeners don't have to worry about, necessarily worry about the costs associated with some things like that. So if you're just wanting to get the earliest or have the most widely available harvest season for some of these crops, you may choose to transplant some things that aren't typical. And certainly, don't let a list keep you from experimenting or trying something new. Some basics associated with doing your own transplants. What's good is when we talk about temperatures, pretty much your home environment, which is where we're talking about growing these. We're not talking about asking you to put up a greenhouse to grow these transplants. These are something that you're doing in your own home. And what's good about that, your ambient household conditions work pretty well. Depending exactly what crop we're talking about, typically the ideal range is anywhere from 50 to 75. There's a few that might be a little bit warmer than that, but not a lot. Something like eggplant comes to mind that it can be warmer, but it certainly can do well 70 to 75 degrees as well. One thing that's good and hopefully is happening in these situations is that there's a temperature differential between night and day. So having a lower temperature at night is good for the plant. It's natural for the plant out of doors. So that is a good thing. Don't think that you have to have supplemental heat if you allow your house to cool off at night. So that differential is a good thing. It is ideal to locate these plants away from direct drafts, particularly if we're talking about doors where people will be entering and exiting, because we can still have some quite chilly weather between now and when they would go out planted in the garden. But we do want good airflow. So don't stick these in a corner of the basement where, there's not a lot of air movement whatsoever. We do want good airflow. We don't want stagnant air around them, because when air doesn't move around, it can become very humid thanks to those plants and the media that is transpiring or evaporating water into the air. And so, having good airflow helps keep the area more moderate around those plants in the immediate vicinity. Also think about, sometimes growing transplants can be a little messy. I know I've got house plants. I'm always trying to be careful, make sure I'm not dumping water everywhere whenever I go to water. Sometimes I'm more or less successful at that. And so making sure that you site where you physically place these plants for growing, or excuse me, the setup for growing these plants, you would want to keep that in mind. You certainly wouldn't want to put them in an area that would be super sensitive if water were to be spilled on the floor, for instance. One of the big things we want to talk about is, what do we grow these transplants in, the media or the soil, if you will. But in truth, it's not soil typically. So you can find, and I think even some of the resources I will send you, they reference some kind of make your own potting soil recipes, and certainly you can do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem with using soil like out of the garden is that it's not sterilized. And so if it's not sterilized, then that means that we could be bringing in any number of different plant pathogens. And young seedlings are very susceptible to some diseases. And because of that, we always want to use potting medias that have been sterilized. And so typically whenever we're buying commercial medias, they actually are not true soils. They don't contain soil. They're composed of materials like peat moss, perlite, composted barks. There'll be additions such as lime to make sure pH is appropriate, different sorts of fertilizers to make sure the nutrition is appropriate. And so they're actually a very artificial creation, but they work really well. What I always encourage people when it comes to buying potting media is, avoid the most expensive and avoid the least expensive. Typically, the most expensive has some sort of gimmicky thing to it. Maybe it's just a fancy name that you're paying for, a well-known company. Very often, the very cheapest option is very low quality. So generally the mid-grade materials, you won't find a tremendous difference between different brands. I've used national name brands before. I have used generic store brands before, each with equally good results. So potting media doesn't have to be something that costs an arm and a leg. Certainly if you're going to be looking at doing larger volumes over a season, it's typically smart to buy it in a larger bag. So certainly they have, the bags that are just a few quarts in size, but they also have those that are several cubic feet. And so certainly buying in bulk, and it's basically not going to go bad on you. So I've had some that, it's taken me a few years to use through the large bag of potting media, and it's not seen a negative result. So just consider that if you're sensitive to price. One question, and I think it's a good question to ask at this point, is, do I have to use specifically a seed starting media? I would say no, but you do want that sterile mix, although seed starting medias are good, particularly for smaller seeds. So a lot of our just general potting soils, they have some rather large particles compared to the seed we're sowing. And so what that means is smaller seedlings have a harder time pushing through those soils. You have larger pore spacing in there. Literally think of the difference between filling up a garbage can with basketballs and filling up a garbage can with golf balls. The golf balls are more densely packed, and so the space in between them is smaller. And so when you have really large air pockets, what happens is small roots and things like that will not grow through those air pockets. So sometimes having that lighter mix that's smaller particles, like we find with seed starting mixes, is definitely an advantage. You can also take your general potting mix and just sift it. Now, obviously, that's labor and time on your part, so certainly it may be a better return just to purchase a seed starting mix depending on your volume. I will mention that if you think you're going to be doing a lot of transplants, you may want to consider sourcing your media mix from a farm store. They will have, again, multi-cubic foot bags or bales available for farmers that are starting transplants. And that's going to be a lot cheaper than buying a bunch of the very small bags at a box store. So you may want to consider that as a source. One thing, and I see a typo on my screen, it should say make sure to moisten the media, not re-moisten the media. So especially when we're dealing with medias that have peat in them, which a lot do, when they dry out, they are extremely dry. In fact, they are referred to as being hydrophobic. So they actually don't take up the water well at all. So I encourage you the day or evening before you want to use these products, pull out the quantity you plan on using and start wetting it down. Spray it down with the hose. And lots of times what you will find is the media is floating on the surface of the water. That's okay. If you leave it for several hours, you'll come back and find that it's absorbed the water and it's able to be used. So do take that in consideration. You don't want to go to plant everything and then realize that your media isn't moist, and it's going to take several hours before it gets to the point that you can use it. And again, here's the tip I mentioned about sourcing from a farm store. So do consider that. If we're talking about containers, we can spend a lot of time on this, so we'll just kind of cover some high points and then look at some specific examples on the next screen. So here's the biggie. Water must drain out of that container. So certainly you see depicted there in the bottom, just your basic kind of 4-cell packs that are in a tray. They work great. They work perfect. You can buy these pretty easily available. They're in many retail stores. But that's not the only option because there's a lot of other things that can actually do that. Certainly, I mentioned earlier, like some of the peat-based pots and things like that are a possible choice. We'll mention some more about that, but one thing that is a factor to take in consideration with the peat-based materials is they dry out faster. Because the peat itself is able to wick moisture, it's creating a larger surface area that's losing water, and consequently they dry out faster. So just be aware, if you are using peat pots, you may have to water those faster than a plastic pot of the same size. And of course, plastic pots come in many different forms, shapes, and sizes. I have very often used 6, 8, or even 12-ounce cups to good effect. Just make sure, again, you're poking holes in the bottom of those cups so they do drain water out. Because the key with any container we're using, and you can certainly be creative with this and repurpose. So if you love to eat yogurt, yogurt containers are a great size for a lot of transplants. Again, just make sure you put a hole in there. And if that container can grow a plant, and if we can remove it where we're not damaging the root system significantly as we do that, then it's going to be a container that could work to do this. I will say, and it's a question that often is asked, is can we reuse containers? The answer is yes, but with a little bit of a caveat. Because of different diseases and things like that that can carry over in used materials, we need to wash those and clean them first. So using a detergent, physical actions and things of that nature, and then use a sanitizer. We can't sanitize surfaces that are not clean. That's something that I think a lot of people are more familiar with proper cleaning and sanitizing procedures thanks to COVID. And so, it's something that we have to first clean those pots. So, physically removing residue of soil or plants in them, getting them visibly clean to us, but then taking the next step in sanitizing to kill any pathogens that may be there is important. So certainly we can reuse plastics, and a lot of people, because of being more eco-conscious, may shy away from plastics. But certainly a lot of the plastics we use in our garden are able to be reused multiple years, and that certainly I think helps with the impact on the environment. So here are some different examples I grabbed off the web on how or containers that people are choosing to start plants in. So in the upper left, we see a seedling in a toilet paper roll. Kind of unique. That was one I have to admit I hadn't seen before, but they've got 2 little, I believe, parsley plants in there. Well, that's what I'll say they are anyway. And what I think about is that's a very small container. So certainly if you were going to plant out a very small seedling or transplant, that might work, but that's not going to work well for a nice, robust tomato plant, for example. So take in consideration the volume available to you. I would say we have that same limitation on the egg carton depicted below. Also, because we got a lot of surface area there that is able to wick water, it's going to dry out quickly. The same thing with the toilet paper roll. Certainly, newspapers have been used for a number of years to create pots for growing seedlings. I think that's something that can work well. What I like about this picture, and one reason why I included it, if you look at the size of those are not small little things. So I know I've seen some little contraptions, let's call it, for making your own pots out of newspaper that they're very small in size. You know, I'm thinking of a small spool of thread or something like that, not large at all, or a 35 millimeter film case, if people are still familiar with those. That sort of thing that doesn't lend itself to having a large enough volume for a large plant. Assuming those are standard tray sizes, that's probably a 32 or 48 count to that tray by the time they're done. And so that's a good sized volume of soil for a number of different transplants. You'll also note too in that picture, I think you can see where there's more than one seedling in each cell, as we would call it, if that was like a cell pack, or in each container. That can be a good way to do it. We'll talk about that a little bit later, so just file that away. In the right-hand corner, you see some of the expanded peat pellets. In this particular instance, and they do have multiple sizes of these on the market, that is a very small volume, and they have a large number of plants in there. So thinning those out to a single plant and then transplanting it soon, because that plant's going to quickly run out of space for those roots. And so when a transplant becomes overgrown for its pot, it becomes more root bound. It's not going to grow well. It gets stunted. There's actually some research that shows that whenever we have plants that are stunted as transplants, that can actually carry over into the production phase in the field. So, you know, having small, rapidly growing transplants is actually preferred to having large, overgrown transplants that are root bound. So we'll talk about that a little bit further when we talk about when we plant these seeds for transplants. But, you know, making sure that the timing is good so we don't have plants languishing in small containers is important. And then lastly, the picture bottom right, that just shows a variety of what I believe to be repurposed containers that someone is using, and certainly perfectly acceptable. You don't have to have every plant in exactly the same size pot. Just again, if you're reusing things, make sure that they're cleaned and sanitized. So another question you may have, do I need to use the dome thingy or a heat mat, not a map? I was great at typing today, I think. But the answer is maybe. And the reason is they do actually have some benefits associated with them. So domes help to retain the moisture. It prevents those media from drying out as quickly. You're not going to keep those on, obviously, the entire life, but early in the process of germination, they can be a benefit, but certainly not a requirement. So don't allow not having one of those to slow you down. Certainly you can create your own. You can stick some pencils in the media and then use any sort of plastic you may have available to accomplish the same thing, because even when they are germinating, for instance, they really don't need a lot of sunlight, with a couple of exceptions that we'll mention. And heating mats certainly are something that can be great to use. We can use those for propagating other plants like cuttings and things like that. What's great about using them with germination of seeds, it really speeds up the process. So you can really get those seeds out of the ground faster, get them started earlier. So when you see ranges associated with germination where it says 7 to 14 days, certainly using heat mats can help get us to the lower end of that range. And so it gets us quicker on the way we want to go. So good to have, nice to use, but certainly not required for success. Do you need supplemental light? I would say yes, ordinarily. There may be some rare instances when windows provide sufficient light, but quite frankly, those are very few and far between. And what generally happens is what you see depicted there in the picture. You don't have sufficient light. You have plants that are growing in one direction. They become what we call leggy, or the technical term is etiolated or etiolation. And what it is, you start getting larger spacing between plant nodes because it's quite literally stretching towards that bright light source. And so you start getting these plants that are overgrown for what they should be because they're so long and stringy. So certainly not the best quality transplant that we can grow. We can look at using fluorescent as well as LED lights. I will say there's probably not as much information about LED as I might like. Even on the commercial side, there's still a lot of research in finding out what setups are great to use. But certainly fluorescent lights have been used with excellent results for decades. When you're setting those up, you want to be 2 to 4 inches above the plant. And you want to have the ability to adjust that as the plant grows. So having some sort of system, and certainly there are systems you can buy that do that for you, but there's some homegrown systems you can create yourself with various sorts of hangers that allow you just to move those lights up and down. This was one resource I found that will also be included in your email. The fluorescent tubes are probably the most effective when it comes to initial purchase price. LEDs are definitely a higher priced item. And so that's why, you know, I'd certainly hope to find some better research that really lets us dial in what LEDs to buy for the best results. But if you're not familiar with the different sorts of fluorescent tube bulbs out there, there's T12s, which is kind of the older technology. There's T8s and now even T5s. And so T8s and T5s are more efficient than T12s, but they do come with higher cost. T8 is kind of that middle ground that a lot of people gravitate towards because it's only a minimal cost increase compared to the older T12 technology, and it's 20 to 25% more efficient. And what's great is we don't actually have to purchase, you know, bulbs that are either wide spectrum bulbs or the true quote unquote, you know, grow lights. Grow lights do have a broader spectrum than just the cool white tubes. And moving on to another, I just pulled these quotes because I thought they were so good. So when we're talking about these fluorescent tubes, the standard cool white tubes actually produce primarily blue and yellow-green segments of the light spectrum. And so those are actually something that is photosynthetically active with plants. So you can do a good job just by using standard fluorescent tube bulbs to do that. Certainly the more full spectrum grow lights do offer a broader spectrum of light, including more red. And so it does sometimes enhance growth. But on the short period of time that we're talking about transplants, it may certainly not be worth quite the investment to go full spectrum bulbs or grow lights. And so there's a recommendation here where they talk about maybe replacing a single cool bulb, the cool white bulbs, with one of the quote unquote grow lights so that you get some of the benefits without having the full cost. So certainly fluorescent tubes, as old of technology as they are, still are very effective at growing plants. So don't allow cost of LEDs make you think that you can't do it. Certainly LEDs are much more energy efficient, and that's why there's so much interest in them in all forms of lighting. But I think that there is less product development right now for the home grower than we might like to see. One thing we need to mention about growing transplants is fertilization. And be careful that you don't do too much of a good thing. So whenever we are pushing plants with fertilizer, when we're giving them more than we should, we naturally have a lot of negative results. It can actually create the conditions that are ideal for various disease infections. It can create, overgrown plants that suddenly, aren't going to transplant well out into the garden. So we definitely want to use it in moderation. Your growing media, if you're purchasing one, very likely may have some fertilizer in it. Oftentimes, if it does, it will talk about, no need to fertilize for 2 months or something like that. And so certainly if it is one that includes it, follow the labeled directions on it in regards to any additional fertilization you may want to do. Because again, for that short time span that you're growing that transplant, none may be needed. And so that can be one less task. However, if you're utilizing a media that does not have fertilizer in it and you want to use a fertilizer, and I should say you should use a fertilizer if your media is absent of it, a good rate to use is half the label rate of a water-soluble fertilizer. So there's a lot of fertilizers out there that we use in the garden. Multiple companies have them. Miracle Grow is just one of a host of companies. And so certainly utilizing half the label rate of those sorts of water-soluble fertilizer is a good way to fertilize your plants. And so if it says do it every 2 weeks, I would still probably follow that, but only use half the rate that is suggested by the label. Keep in mind, those plants are very small, and so they don't have huge demands on nutrients in the beginning. So what about some practicalities about actually sowing the seed into those containers? Well, I thought since we can't do this in person and I didn't want to get potting media all over the apartment, I thought I'd better kind of write up a little something. So this is a process, the kind of way I do it when I'm growing any transplants. I start by filling up my container nearly full or basically full with the media I'm using, and then I'll water in the media. The reason I do that is that helps collapse any air pockets or things like that. So normally we would see the volume of that media subside in the container. It's going to go down. Depending how much that does, lots of times when I'm filling those containers, I'm very lightly packing. I'm not trying to, pack as much as possible in there, but I'm compressing it a little bit so I don't have huge air pockets. So if I don't have a huge drop in the amount of volume of media in there, I may just go ahead and place the seed on top of the media and then cover it over. We don't want to cover it too deeply. Typically about twice the width of the seed is what we'll do. And so, lightly placing media over it works. The larger the seed is, the less sensitive we have to be with that. Large seeds have large energy reserves for pushing through soils. And so certainly larger seeds, it's a little bit less concerning. But one reason I like this is when we have smaller seed, and we'll mention about this a little bit further, it can be very easy to actually float the seed out of your potting media if you go to water over the top after you've put seed in there. So that's why I like to water before I put seed in there. Certainly, that's not the only way or the correct way to do it. There's multiple ways of doing this. You can obviously plant your seed and then water and do that with great effect. But purposely, I do this especially with smaller seeds because I do find sometimes seeds will float or wash off the media if I'm not careful about how I am watering them. I mentioned it just a moment ago. How deep do you plant them? Typically anywhere from 2 to 3, even 4 times their width, depending on the exact seed. What I encourage you to do is look at your seed packets. Seed packets will typically have planting depth on them to help give you success. So I encourage you to look at your seed packets. There's great information there. I also encourage you to sow more than one seed per cell or container. The reason we want to do that is we'll thin to the strongest plant. Not every seed you plant and not every seed that even germinates is going to give you a good plant. And so by going ahead and planting more than one seed, we can choose the best of it and move forward and make sure we have a strong plant growing in that container. You can, allow more than one seed to remain, but often when you go to try to untangle those, when it's time to transplant them in the garden, you end up with 2 plants with ripped apart root systems rather than 2 good plants or even 1 good plant. So often it's kind of a poor return to allow more than one plant to exist. So what about a few special cases? And so this concerns about how deeply we plant the seed. So there actually are some plants whose seed requires light to germinate. And so this is not an exhaustive list. There are others, but lettuce, dill, snapdragons, and petunias are all examples of this. So the way we would actually plant these is just lightly place the seed on the soil and then water it in. We wouldn't actually cover them anymore, because if we cover them with soil, we're going to block the light that's going to initiate germination. So make sure, again, you should see those sort of references on seed packets. It's not, the majority of plants out there, but certainly there are some that you will find this to be the case. And one thing I really want you to encourage you to do is label, label, label. You will absolutely forget what you planted, or at least I do. And so certainly labeling what I've planted and even the date can sometimes be helpful, because that helps you say, well, now wait a second, how many days ago did I plant this, and shouldn't it already be up? It gives you an actual reference point. Plus, too, if you're doing multiple dates of sowing, it makes sure that the oldest plants are, getting out quicker, that you're not letting something languish on the side or in the back. So definitely labeling and whatever information you may want to include, of course, is your choice. But I think definitely what it is and the date makes a lot of sense. Watering, we do want to allow these plants to grow out. One thing that happens is sometimes we just want to keep watering all the time, and there are issues with that. Among them, when we don't allow those plants to basically go through a little bit of a dry period, we're actually encouraging them not to grow roots. So allowing that media to dry out helps encourage them to grow roots, and then we'll come back and water. As the seedlings get larger, you're going to increase your frequency. The plants are using more water. Very elementary, but it's just important to recognize it is going to change over the life of that transplant. And let me offer that you may not want to use your typical watering can for watering transplants. Certainly you can, but again, with smaller things, sometimes that can be a challenge. So actually spray bottles can work very well. Placing them on a mist setting and wetting things down doesn't take much time at all. Typically, when we're talking about transplants, it's a very concentrated and confined area that we're watering. So spray bottles work well. There's also any sort of sprinkler things that you can place in the end of a bottle that gives you, again, a gentle flow of water onto plants. So certainly, trying some of these alternative methods may help you do a good job with watering. The reason we're so concerned about watering and making sure that things dry out is that there are diseases that plants can get. And so typically the fungal disease that we see plants getting when they're being grown as transplants is a Pythium species of one kind or another. It's hard to see, but on the right-hand picture, you see the white kind of hairs or grayish hairs growing on the soil around that seed. That is actually the fungal hyphae, or the body of that fungus that's growing. And it's going to, if it hasn't already, it's going to be very quickly infecting that seedling. Oddly enough, one of the symptoms we often see with Pythium diseases, with damping off, is actually the plants laying over, almost as if they're wilting because of lack of water. What's literally happened, if you look closely on the picture on the left, you see where that stem looks very narrowed and constricted. That's actually the fungus has destroyed that stem. And so there's no support for it to stand upright, so it falls over. And so sometimes people see seedlings leading and they think, oh, I need to water, it's wilting, it needs water. And that's actually the exact opposite. Typically we see Pythium problems when we have too wet of conditions. And so allowing things to dry out is basically the principal control method for damping off. And so that's also where, when we have small seeds, don't completely soak everything, or small seedlings I should say, don't completely soak everything in sight. Being specific with where you're putting water can help limit the amount of moisture that's there and help the conditions not promote Pythium diseases. So do take that in consideration. So one of the last steps we do with plants before we go into the garden, it's called hardening them off or hardening. And what we're literally doing is we're basically just getting the plants used to being outdoors. The indoor environment is a much nicer place to be. You don't have the extremes of solar radiation. Just like we can get sunburns, so can plants. And while I always, tell people to slowly transition their house plants out in the spring, quite often I end up sunburning a couple of mine because I don't take my own great advice. So don't be like me. But taking plants out, including our transplants, for increasing periods of time gets them exposed to higher light levels. What we don't want to do is go and place them directly in full sun, because if we do that, we are going to see negative effects. So placing them sometimes under trees in shade is a great way to start, and then bringing them back in, because oftentimes, even as we're getting close to going out of doors, overnight can still be a little chilly, so we don't want to leave them out there all the time. But increasing the amount of time that they're outdoors can and will be a good method of hardening them off. We can also start with holding water a little bit. Now, we want to take cautions with this. We don't want to cause our plants to be wilting. But again, kind of just delaying sometimes how often we're watering helps encourage those plants to say, hey, I need to look for water. And their response is to then start growing more roots. So again, withholding water some, giving them a little bit of a stress, not tremendous. We don't want to see plants wilting down, but giving them a little bit less frequent watering can help encourage them to harden off and be ready to go in the garden. And so a big thing we haven't even talked about yet is, when do we start these transplants? Because that's a big thing with this. Start too early and you're going to end up with a plant that is not ideal. Start too late, it might be better just to direct seed on a number of our crops. So as a rule, generally speaking, most of our crops are anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks in length for growing a transplant. That's acceptable to go out into the garden. One of the notable examples outside of that would be peppers. They're a little bit slower growing, so 7 to 9 weeks is a recommendation you see frequently. So just take that into mind, that if you were wanting to do, for instance, peppers and tomatoes both, you would actually want to start the peppers maybe a week before. Certainly, a smaller plant can go out with the tomatoes if you started them at the same time. But just understand that they are a little bit slower growing. So if you plant them at the same date, they will lag a little bit behind tomatoes, for instance. And so what's important is you're going to get this resource, the Growing Vegetable Transplants for Home Gardens, which has this graph in there that kind of gives you some information about how to do that. So it looks at what the ideal germination temperature is, growing temperature, so what sort of range are you looking for, and then how to harden them off. And certainly the approximate growing time in weeks. I will say, if I were to err on one side or the other, I would much rather have a small plant going into their garden than one that's too large. So I always encourage people to basically consult with the next set of resources, which are the Guide to Spring Planted Cool Season Vegetable, Guide to Warm Season Garden Vegetables, and lastly, the Fall Vegetable Gardens. I don't know why they didn't call it Guide to Fall Vegetable Gardens, because it's the same exact document, just a different focus and time. But those are the ones that talk about when can we start planting these out in our garden. And so grabbing the date out of these references and then counting back, utilizing the first reference to say, okay, if I'm going to plant out May 10th for my tomatoes, I need to start those maybe 6 weeks prior. And so utilizing those two resources is how you determine when you want to start these. And again, certainly it doesn't mean a 5-week-old plant can't go out into the garden. Small young plants often take off in the garden, do really well, because they are in a phase of growth that's rapid. The other thing you can do, maybe if you start a little too early and you realize it, you can actually take plants and pot them up into larger containers. But certainly, I've noticed a trend in the past few years within garden centers and things where individual, for instance, tomato plants may be coming in a 8-inch pot. Certainly, you don't have to have a transplant that large to be successful in the garden. And of course, it comes with a higher cost because it's been growing in a greenhouse for a considerable amount of time to get there. So do take in consideration, how much time and space you have. And sometimes a smaller transplant can actually work much better than one that's too large. So with that, we will pause for questions.